Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Megan Litweiler, and I am the Academic Programs Manager at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And I am delighted to welcome you all to our series, New Energy Conversations with Early Career Researchers. We have a great talk today to kick off our winter season of the program. So we're very excited to have you all here and to have our wonderful speaker here. If you haven't joined us for New Energy before, this series is now in its third year, and it first launched as a way to give early career energy scholars from around the country and the world a platform to share their research, and as a way that we can all learn about emerging topics in energy and society. And New Energy has kind of become a community for early career scholars to connect and network and collaborate, and we're really excited about how this has kind of taken off. Now, at the end of our talk today, you'll have a chance to ask some questions of our speaker. So if you'd like to enter those during the presentation, you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, we'll welcome our speaker, Chris, in just a moment. But first, we are delighted to have Professor Rich Howarth here to moderate the session. Rich is a professor of environmental studies at Dartmouth College, and he is an environmental economist who studies the interplay between economic analysis and the ecological, moral, and social dimensions of environmental governance. His research focuses on the valuation and management of ecosystem services, theories of discounting and intergenerational justice, climate stabilization policy, the ethical foundations of pro-environmental behaviors, and the relationship between economic growth, human well-being, and environmental quality. Thank you so much for being here. Rich, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yeah, well, thank you for that nice introduction to the introduction. I also have that it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Chris Callahan. I've known Chris since 2008 when he got started here as a PhD student in the program on ecology, evolution, environment, and society. And while this is a big program and it covers a lot of ground, what Chris's work is doing is looking really hard at the interface between environmental science, and in particular, a mechanistic understanding of climate science, and then the impacts that climate change has on society and also on ecosystems. But especially he's interested in the economic damages caused by climate change. Chris came to Dartmouth from an undergraduate degree in environmental science at Northwestern. And he's finishing up his dissertation now, and he'll describe to you in detail what some of his main findings are, which I think are quite exciting. I guess I would make a couple of points here. One is that Chris is a really excellent example of a new generation of scientists and researchers who really are integrating concepts from the biophysical sciences and the social sciences, in particular economics in this case. Environmental problems are cross-cutting, and if we don't make those connections, we will get things wrong and get the wrong answers to problems where it's very important that we get the right answers. And also, he will discuss, I'm sure, with you the toolkit that he's using, which relates to a set of methods from econometrics. And econometrics is the way that economists do statistics. It's grounded in trying to draw causal inferences, even when you're working with big, messy data sets. And if you're a statistics geek, the truism that you can't establish causality based on correlation. Well, econometrics and some of the tools that Chris is applying are an effort to look under the hood and get at that. So Chris, welcome, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Rich. I really appreciate that introduction. Let me make sure I have all this screen sharing going. Does that look good? Someone might need to give me a thumbs up, Rich or Megan. All right, I got a thumbs up. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for the introduction, Rich. I really appreciate it. Rich has been a really fantastic mentor to me over the last 5 years as I've been here in my PhD, and so I'm excited to talk about the work I've been doing on a couple different topics, all sort of centered around the linkages between the climate and the economy. And that is a sort of central theme of my dissertation research, as I've been here since 2018, is understanding what changes in the physical climate mean for the human systems that we care about, both trying to understand those things from an empirical perspective and then understand their implications for climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and other questions like that as we move into this sort of emerging energy transition that we're all witnessing. My work is in a lot of ways motivated by some really fundamentally impactful events that the world has seen over the last several years. Last year, nearly a third of Pakistan was underwater due to floods driven by extreme rainfall that we have tied pretty explicitly to climate change. The Pacific Northwest 2 years ago experienced record-shattering heat extremes by 10 degrees or more in some regions, and this had immense effects on people and ecosystems, and really revealed that we had maybe even been underestimating the degree to which these kinds of extreme events have been accelerating due to climate change. Last year, China was in a drought and heat wave, a sort of combined event of these two things that lasted for months, which was absolutely unprecedented, and again revealed that we need to be humble in our understanding of how climate change is affecting the things that we care about in very direct ways, and raise the urgency of understanding our, the systems that we manage, the systems that we care about, the indicators of well-being that tell us how people are doing in our world. And my research is really an attempt to get a handle on some of these things, although a very limited handle it may be. The sort of basic conceptual framework for my research is to think about the climate and the economy as a coupled system. So economic production generates fossil fuel emissions. These fossil fuel emissions have greenhouse gas, contain greenhouse gases that warm the atmosphere, that change the physical climate. But those changes in the physical climate also feed back onto our economy. We call these climate damages, this is a term we use to refer to the effect of a changing climate on the economic, social, human, dimensions of well-being. And this coupled system has interactions and feedbacks and dynamics to it that are incredibly complex and difficult to understand, but we need to get as much of a handle on it as we can if we're to understand the implications both of climate change and of a sort of emerging energy transition for our well-being. But just as this coupled system has different feedback loops and pathways and mechanisms, so too must we use different methodological approaches and disciplinary perspectives to get a handle on this system. This is something that Rich hinted at in his introduction, which is that I try to take a very intentional approach to using methods from multiple disciplines and multiple perspectives to understand the implications of energy production and climate change for our well-being. The basic outline of the way that I think about my methodologies is that I am a modeler in a very capacious sense of that term. I use statistical models that relate climate variables to economic outcomes. This is the econometric approach that Rich talked about in his introduction. And this uses observed data, so data we can look at on, say, the occurrence of heat waves over time and the occurrence of fluctuations in economic growth over time. And we can try and relate those two things, in a way that is functionally just a fancy correlation. This is sort of a schematic that I'm showing here, and the correlations never quite look as nice as this, but the basic idea is that we can perform some statistical modeling to isolate in the real world relationships between climate fluctuations that are varying somewhat randomly and the outcomes that we care about from a human or economic perspective. This allows us to ground our understanding of the relationship between the climate and the economy in an empirical sense. It allows us to use observed data to assess those effects in ways that go beyond pure theory. But I combine these kinds of statistical models and the hopefully causal inferences that we can draw from these models with climate models. These are large-scale computational simulations of the Earth system that allow us to understand what humans have done to the Earth system via the emission of greenhouse gases. Critically, we do not have multiple Earths on which to perform experiments. We don't have a control climate for the climate that we have altered via our experiment of greenhouse gas emissions and the resulting global warming. And so we use these big computational simulations of the Earth to run experiments and say, what would the world have looked like without, for example, human-caused climate change? And that allows us to say, for example, draw these inferences about what the quote-unquote counterfactual without human climate change would have been, or say in the future, as we continue to emit more or less greenhouse gas emissions, what are the various climate futures that we might be faced with moving into the rest of the 21st century and even potentially beyond? I'm going to gloss over some of the details in these because I want to talk about a few different things I've worked on over the course of my PhD, but please don't hesitate to ask questions about any of the details of these methods or their application to any of the things I'm going to talk about in a bit. For the sake of time, I'm going to sort of leave them abstract, but I'm happy to dig in if folks are interested in some of the mechanics behind either of these things or their combination. So thinking about using these different methods to understand this coupled system that I've described before, I want to start by outlining a couple different projects I've worked on that focus on this top loop, this climate damages pathway, meaning the relationship between climate fluctuations and economic outcomes. And I'm going to focus on two specific types of extreme events, heat waves and El Nino. These are both, and I'll dig into both in a second, these are both events or sources of climate impacts on people that we'd like to understand in more quantitative and detailed ways. So critically, though, one question that we need to ask, and one sort of component of the research I've done on this area is, if we need to understand the relationship between, say, a heat wave and economic, how will more intense heat waves affect our economic growth in the future, we need to be able to distinguish between effects of these events on our economies that may be short-term and transient or longer-term and more persistent. So to concretize what I mean here, I want to show this schematic where this is GDP per capita over time. So this is the income in an economy, the size of an economy over time. You can see this sort of schematic of an economy growing. Our economy is growing bigger. We're doing technological innovation and productivity increases and all these things. But at a certain time, our economy gets hit with, say, a disaster. This might be a severe heat wave, might be an El Nino event, or a hurricane, or a financial crisis, or an earthquake, or what have you, or a war, any of these things. There are many possible ways that an economy could respond to such a disaster. Two potential ways are a sort of short-term effect like this. We call this a, quote, level effect, because this implies that the level of output in any given year has been shocked by some disaster like a heat wave or a war, but then it returns to its long-term trajectory. You get this rebound effect where the economy experiences a decline, but then returns back to the way it was before. For example, because of reconstruction investment, if your crops are destroyed, you can resow those crops, things along those lines. But you could also imagine more persistent effects. These are in some cases called growth effects, implying that the ability of the economy to grow over time has been limited. And this manifests as this more persistent reduction. You can think of this, if you've ever had a savings account, you can think of this from the perspective of compound interest. If you reduce the rate at which your savings account compounds, that is going to have long-term reductions in the amount of money you have in that account because you're not growing it exponentially over time at the rate you were before. Critically, these two different outcomes have very different effects long-term. So if you run this out another 10 or 20 years, a level effect disappears by that time. You've rebounded to your previous trajectory, but this persistent growth effect tends to accumulate and can grow larger exponentially over time. And so distinguishing empirically between these two types of effects is really critical. And that's what I'm going to show in the context of these two different types of extreme events in a way that I think is kind of interesting. And so the first type that we looked at in a paper that was published earlier this year with my advisor, Justin Mankin, is heat waves. And this is in many ways one of the prominent, one of the central ways that our economy and our lives are going to be impacted by climate change. You take temperature, this is a sort of distribution of temperature over the year. You have some cold days, you have a lot of normal days, and you have some hot days, sort of this bell curve shape. Take that whole thing, you slide it warmer, you're gonna get a lot more extreme hot weather. The physics of this are very well understood. And it's not really a question that this has already started and will continue into the future. The economic consequences, however, are a little less well understood. And so we took the approach that I hinted at before, where we empirically related the occurrence of heat waves in regions around the world to the occurrence of fluctuations in economic growth to tie those two things together. We use some other fancy statistics to control for other factors like geography or institutions or long-term trends in climate and the economy, and derive some sort of potentially causal relationship between heat waves and economic outcomes. And so the way I'm going to visualize this result for you all here is by illustrating this in the context of sort of this X and Y axis. So what I've got here is on the X axis, the years since the heat wave. So year zero is a year in which a heat wave occurs. This could be 2021 for that Pacific Northwest heat wave, for example. On the y-axis is going to be the cumulative change in economic growth after this event. So you're going to see the potentially sort of added up effects on an economy in terms of the percentage point change in economic growth for, SD there is quote unquote standard deviation. So this is a sort of typical heat wave event that you might witness in a given region. And so what you see here is this decline and then rebound. So you see how in year 0 and year 1, you get this reduction in economic growth, and then you get a rebound back up to 0, implying that over the long term, there is not a persistent or permanent effect on economic growth. You experience reductions, say, for example, because a bunch of crops die, but in several years after a heat wave, you can invest and regrow those crops and return your economy to the trajectory it was on before. This does not imply that heat waves have no effect, because in those several years that you've lost some sort of economic productivity, those effects are still real and people have still lost money or their livelihoods, and these events can be really substantial. And so it just means that that effect is short-term rather than longer term. But what we showed in this paper as well is that if you add up all the different heat waves that climate change has already caused over the last 25 or 30 years, even though in any individual one can have, only has a sort of short-term effect, all of them together have already dampened our economy in a really fundamental way. And so we're able to sort of isolate the role that heat waves have played in the costs of climate change to date, which was an advance over some previous research that had not fully examined the role of extreme heat relative to, say, changing average temperatures. I want to talk about El Nino briefly, because this is the sort of second extreme event that I've looked at in my research that I think draws interesting contrast. El Nino is a phenomenon where you have the pileup of warm water in the Eastern Pacific. So the maps you're looking at, on my left at least, are of the Eastern Equatorial Pacific. So you see on the top right, there's Mexico and Central America. On the bottom left, there's Papua New Guinea and the northern coast of Australia. So you're looking at the sort of equator across the Pacific Ocean. An El Nino event is when warm water, that red blotch, piles up in the Eastern Pacific. A La Nina event is when you have cool water in the Central and Eastern Pacific. These events reorganize the global atmospheric circulation and alter weather patterns like extreme rainfall, heat waves, droughts, floods around much of the world, but especially in the tropics. There are ways we can quantify El Nino over time. So what I'm showing here is an index that we've called the E index from some previous research from 1960 to 2015. And you can see there's this sort of fluctuating back and forth. So if you're in a positive phase, that's an El Nino, that's that warm water. If you're in a negative phase, you're in a La Nina, that's that cool water. And so you get this fluctuating back and forth, punctuated by a few extreme El Nino events in years like 1997 and 98. And we can basically use these fluctuations over time as our quote unquote treatment. If you think about the statistical framework I outlined before, you want to basically assess the effect of a treatment on an economy over time and space. And so we can think about El Nino as this treatment. I've abbreviated on the top there ENSO, ENSO. That just refers to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is another formal name for this phenomenon, but it means the same thing. And so what I'm going to show is a similar analysis of the economic effect of this phenomenon on tropical countries over time. And so I'm showing a similar plot here on the right relative to, next to this heat wave plot I showed before. And so I'm showing the years since the El Nino event on the bottom, and then the cumulative effect on the y-axis. And what you can see is something very different. You can see that these effects accumulate. They are not recovered in the 5 years after an El Nino event. And we can actually show that they were not recovered even 10 or 15 years after an El Nino event, implying that as far as we can tell, these effects are close to permanent. When economies are hit by very large El Nino events, they may lose crops, flooding may destroy infrastructure, productive capacity may be destroyed, and the economy appears to be affected enough in countries like Peru, Ecuador, Australia, Papua New Guinea, parts of Central Africa, that these economies do not recover and in fact are sort of depressed over the long term in an accumulating fashion. There's one other thing I want to point out here on these two graphs that I have not mentioned before, which is the little annotation for warm regions and highly teleconnected tropical countries. So it's really important to know that these effects that we show are highly unequal. So in the context of heat waves, we show that heat waves have a noticeably greater negative effect on economic output in warm tropical regions. So this means places that are sort of in the already warm tropical band that are already near a sort of danger zone of extreme heat. Not so much in the United States, Europe, and other places in the northern or farther southern hemisphere. And so this sort of global spatial pattern of the effect of extreme heat implies really substantial inequality in the effects of climate extremes, especially because places in the tropics are also disproportionately lower income, and they're disproportionately lower emitting. So the places that have contributed least to the problem of climate change and who are most vulnerable to it may also suffer the most due to the effects of these extreme events. And the same is true for El Nino. So these tropical countries that are quote unquote teleconnected, meaning that their climates are strongly affected by El Nino on a year-to-year basis. El Nino provokes extreme rainfall in Peru and Ecuador and drought in Australia. And so if you're in that tropical band, you are strongly affected by these fluctuations in these events. And so those same tropical regions that are most vulnerable to and least responsible to climate change may also suffer the most from potential changes in El Nino events due to warming and may experience substantial negative outcomes. This inequality in these effects is a core theme throughout much of my research and motivated some of the next work that we did and sort of a different perspective on this question of the effects of climate change on the economy. So if you return to this sort of vision of this coupled climate economy system, one thing that is important to realize, as I hinted at with this inequality theme, is that the world has not equally contributed to climate change. The economy is not one phenomenon. It's a world economy that is unequally distributed and has unequally contributed to warming. And so in the context of, say, for example, emerging discussions over loss and damage in the international climate arena, which refers to this push to have higher emitting countries compensate lower emitting countries for the costs of climate-driven economic losses, we might ask what the contribution of individual countries is to the fossil fuel emissions that have driven warming and the resulting economic effects of warming. And so that's another perspective we've taken on this issue that I want to highlight for you all. So what I'm talking about next is sort of a project we did that answers the question, who is responsible for the economic impacts of historical warming? And so this project uses some of the same economic and econometric methods I talked about before, but combines them with some different climate simulations. So to walk through the way that we answered this question, we take a three-part approach. And so I'm going to walk through these three plots and talk about how we were able to answer this question. So the far left, the plot that's titled National Contributions to Global Mean Temperature, my advisor, Justin Mankin, and I took an approach where we took a simple climate model, so not a giant computer simulation, but something that was very efficient, could run on your laptop, and not computationally expensive. And we said, what if you can emit all the emissions that we have already emitted over the course of the last 50 years, just the way that we've done it. But then you can imagine, what if a single country, like say the United States, had not emitted from say 1990 onwards or 1960 onwards? What would the world have looked like had those emissions not occurred? And you can run that simulation and you can see, for example, that red line is what the world did look like, and then the blue line is what the world would have looked like without the United States. And we can repeat this experiment for any country or any emitting actor that you might be interested in. That gives us changes in global mean temperature. So this is the 1.1 degrees Celsius of global temperature change we've already experienced would have been slightly reduced if the United States, for example, had not emitted over a certain time period. But what we're interested in is the relationship between that sort of global temperature contribution and climate change in other places, specific other places. And so we took an approach called pattern scaling, which I'm not going to go to in much detail here, but it's a pretty simple way of just saying, if you have a change in the global average temperature by some amount, what change in every other individual country do you have? And so you can say, well, if the globe warms up by 1 degree, maybe Nigeria warms up by 0.7 or 0.8 degrees. Maybe Norway warms up by 1.5 degrees because we know the poles have been warming faster. And so that approach can give us a sense of what the contribution of individual countries is to climate change in other places specifically. And so that we can sort of plot, for example, the average country level change in temperature due to global warming historically. We can then combine these country level numbers with relationships that have been previously derived using some of the same econometric techniques that I described before to relate changes in country level temperature to economic outcomes. And so what you can see is this sort of curve that other folks had previously derived that show that when warm places get warmer, their economies suffer because they're already too warm to grow optimally, whereas if you're in a cold region, warming actually benefits you. So if you're on the left, on the low annual mean temperature side, you're moving up the curve and you're growing faster. If you're in a warm place, you're moving down the curve and you're growing more slowly. And so combining these three components of our methodology allows us to say something about the economic impacts of climate change in other places, induced by the emissions by specific actors such as the United States, China, Germany, Russia, et cetera. And so the map that I'm showing here is the effect of specifically the United States' emissions on every other country. So places in red are places where their GDP per capita has declined over the last 25 years by 1 or 2%, specifically due to the United States' emissions. Now, this map does not show that some of these places in the tropics have actually shrunk. Their economies have grown. The world has experienced massive economic growth over the last several decades, especially in places that are lower income. What our work shows is just that those economies would have grown more quickly had there not been the emission of greenhouse gases by major emitting actors like the United States. And so you can see this unequal pattern where there are losses in the tropics, benefits in very cold regions, and we can perform this exercise for major emitting countries around the world. Every country for which we have emissions data, we can sort of rerun this exercise, and we can add up what have the economic effects of these countries' emissions been specifically, not just global warming generally. And so what I'm plotting here is the income losses globally due to the emissions of each country in the map. So the countries that are very red, like the United States, China, Brazil, India, Russia, Canada, these are places that have driven substantial economic losses in tropical regions due to the emission of greenhouse gases by that country specifically. And these exceed $1 trillion from major emitters like the United States and China. These are losses that occur in the tropics. There are similar numbers actually for gains that occur in the higher latitudes. So Canada, Norway, Russia, et cetera, have benefited from global warming. And so these same countries that have emitted a lot have produced economic losses in poorer tropical regions, but economic benefits in higher latitude, cooler regions, which emphasizes the spatial inequity associated with emissions and the inequity associated with both who has suffered from warming and who has contributed to it. These findings are really important from the perspective of climate litigation, which requires the ability to draw a causal link between an individual actor and the downstream effects of that actor's emissions. They're also important from the perspective of loss and damage, as I hinted at before. There's this emerging move in the international climate negotiations to require or ask, really, major emitters to compensate lower emitters for the economic effects of their emissions. But in order for that to have any teeth, we need to know what those economic effects are. And this research is sort of the first salvo in an emerging effort to understand the contributions of individual actors to the losses and damage from climate change in other places. And this is an emerging thread of my research that I will hopefully carry forward to bring a scientific perspective to these political questions of loss and damage that are really fraught, but you could use some scientific backing. The last thing I want to talk about, I want to sort of zoom out for a little bit and re-emphasize this schematic here. And with a little bit of time I have left, I want to zoom out a little bit and take a little bit more abstract perspective and hopefully illustrate some of the implications of this. So I've illustrated hopefully that the climate and economy are coupled to one another. There are feedbacks between each of them where fossil fuel emissions from economic production warm the climate. That climate then reduces in many places, economic output. And so you have this negative feedback where economic output causes warming, but that warming reduces economic output. That is a sort of complicated feedback, and it's one that we've not fully gotten a handle on yet. But I've titled this slide, Climate and Economic Output are Endogenous, meaning that they both affect one another. And you cannot think of the economy producing greenhouse gas emissions that warm the globe without also thinking about the fact that that warming then in turn affects our economies. And so there's a few implications of this that I have just started to draw out in a project that I've been working on in this last phase of my PhD. And so I want to motivate this by describing the sort of socioeconomic scenarios that we use in many climate impact analysis. So you may be familiar, for example, with a plot like this. So what you're seeing on the left here is the sort of classic IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change plot where we see the historical warming that we've already experienced and the different futures that we might expect from global warming. So if we emit a lot over the next century, we might experience those red lines, which are the sort of increases that might be up to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of global warming. If we really strongly cut our emissions, we could move down to those blue lines, which are not nearly as much climate change. These are scenarios, right? They are storylines for potential climate futures. They are not predictions. There are no probabilities associated with each one of these. They're simply explorations of the space of possible outcomes. Each of these potential trajectories has a forecast or a consistent projection of the global economy moving into the future. So these are what we call the SSPs, which are these shared socioeconomic pathways, which are these projections of economic output moving into the future that we say, if the economy grows very strongly, we're producing a lot of fossil fuel emissions, that will drive up global warming. Whereas if the economy grows a little bit more slowly, maybe we're investing in renewables, we're reducing our emissions, we're in that middle of the road pathway, then we're going to sort of end up on that middle of the road or lower down warming trajectory on the left. And so these are economic projections that are used to produce climate scenarios. Critically, that linkage goes one way. We have forecasts of what the economy might look like in the future. Those are used to produce global warming trajectories. We have not yet, in this framework, considered how then those global warming trajectories might then feed back onto the economic projections that are used to produce those scenarios. I hope this is making sense, and I'm happy to chat with anybody who's interested further, but I want to illustrate some of the implications of this potential lack of fully sort of coupling these two components of this system together. So what I mean by this is, for example, in this project that my advisor and I have been working on, we have a sort of very simple conceptual model, even simpler than some of the stuff I've talked about already, where we can link economic production to global warming and then the relationship between that and economic output. And we can explore sort of stylized in this sort of scenario framework what climate damages might look like, and then what the implications of adaptation and mitigation are. And so what I'm showing here is shared socioeconomic pathway 2. It's one of these sort of future trajectories. And we see that the world grows very strongly in terms of its GDP over the course of the next 80 years. You get substantial increases in world GDP. This is because this is a trajectory that's used to project emissions and resulting warming. But if you then sort of re-simulate this scenario using a simple model that then considers how the resulting warming affects the economy that goes into this scenario, you can simulate what GDP might actually look like in this world and incorporating the damages from climate change. And that looks like this. This is really different. We project using this very simple model that the scenarios that build out these climate change projections have really overestimated economic output. Because they have not incorporated the feedback between climate change and the economy, they have neglected an important limit on economic growth that might constrain our economy in the future, and therefore, sort of problematically, these scenarios think of the income and future economic growth as exogenous, just as an influence on the climate, rather than the other way around, as the climate as a constraint on economic growth. And the important thing here is that this, in some ways, is abstract, but also concretizes some of the research I've shown before about the ways in which, once we start to understand the relationship between climate fluctuations and our economies, we get a fuller and potentially more severe picture of the ways that our current vision of future economic trajectories may be limited, may not fully understand or fully account for these emerging linkages that are becoming really central to the field of climate and the economy. I have some more slides here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to sort of skip through them. I'm happy to talk about these if folks are interested, but I want to leave you with a few takeaways, which is that extreme climate events really pose this unequal threat to economic well-being across the globe. And by unequal, I mean that they pose a threat to the well-being of specifically the worst off, the people that are living in the lowest income and the lowest emitting places, which implies this very substantial spatial inequity in both who has contributed from climate change, who's most vulnerable, and who will experience the extreme events that manifest its impacts most strongly. Second, individual major emitters can be held accountable for these impacts, which is a really central component of emerging debates over loss and damage in the international climate arena. And we hope is a theme that can sort of be drawn out further from some of this work, but requires interdisciplinary linkages between climate modeling, economic modeling, and sort of a unified perspective on the climate economy system. Lastly, climate economy feedbacks and couplings demand model hierarchy, meaning we need to use both complex and simple models to understand the stylized relationships between these systems and the mechanistic relationships that might shape their combined evolution in the future, and consideration of the two-way feedbacks between future economic growth projections, the climate damages that result from them, and then the potential constraint on economic output that future climate damages might pose. This also requires an interdisciplinary framework. It's no coincidence that all of these things are united by that idea. And so I hope I can use some of my expertise in both climate science and economics and econometrics to draw a better understanding of this coupled system, and hopefully draw on the expertise of people around Dartmouth, the Irving Institute, and in my future career to get a better sense of what the world looks like under both climate change and the sort of emerging energy transition that we are now witnessing. I want to open things up for questions. I want to first thank NSF for funding, as well as the Rockefeller Institute, the Newcomb Institute, Irving Institute, in which I am sitting right now and where I have had a desk for the last year or so. My advisor, Justin Mankin, and the rest of the climate modeling and impacts group, Alex Gottlieb, Flora Perlmutter, Corey Lesk, Jean Lee, and Noel Siegert, and too many others to name, as well as Rich, who talked before, Caitlin Prees, Jonathan Winter, and Fran Moore, who are members of my dissertation committee and have been really essential influences on my intellectual development so far. I have my contact information up there and my personal website if anyone is interested in the analysis of the publications that have motivated some of this stuff, and I'm happy to take questions if folks have them. Thanks a lot.
All right, well, thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful talk. There definitely are some questions for you in the Q&A section, and we had a couple of email questions that came in to begin with. These are clarifying questions. Maybe we can come back to that, but an email question that came in before the event related to the dynamic integrated climate economy model by William Nordhaus down at Yale. And I mentioned that partly because the question came in, but also because the DICE model, as it's called, which goes back to a 1992 paper in Science, and it's been consistently updated since then. That's an example of the kind of two-way feedback. It represents the kind of two-way feedbacks that you have in mind. And I guess I wonder if you could comment, first of all, what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of DICE? And what might a next generation of models look like? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So Bill Nordhaus is a Yale economist who won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for his work in climate economics. He basically founded the field of climate economics in the sense of understanding the relationship between economic production, CO2 emissions, and climate damages. And so his model, DICE, has been used to estimate those relationships, to draw inferences about something called the social cost of carbon, which is the economic damages associated with emitting a ton of CO2, which is a value that gets used in like regulatory decision-making in the United States, for example, and all these other things. And so that model is very simple. It can be run in Excel. That is a virtue in some ways, not just a problem, not just a drawback. And it's been used, it basically takes the sort of simple model of the economy of economic production, a very simple climate model, a relationship between that climate and economic damages, and combines those two together. Now, one key feature of this model is something that we call the damage function, which is the relationship between climate change and economic losses. I did not say this, but much of my research has been motivated by the fact that this damage function in both DICE and other similar simple climate economy models has often been used in a way that is not empirically grounded. So in a way that was based on theory, which is reasonable, but theory that had not been ground truthed in ways, and so not been compared to our empirical assessments of the ways in which climate fluctuations can be observed to influence economic outcomes. And so DICE is really important and really influential, and hopefully some of my work can be used to get a better handle on that damage function that communicates changes in the climate to changes in economic output. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for that. And just to follow up, the DICE model was based on some early damage assessments relating to the agriculture sector, the cost of sea level rise, impacts of climate change on the energy sector. And the early studies suggested that fairly large temperature increases, like 2 or 3 degrees Celsius, would have fairly small impacts and then the climate economics community locked in on that without as much depth of analysis as I think what we're starting to see now. And I want to come back to this. This comes back to the empirical damage function that you and Justin are using in your climatic change paper. That's also very simple. You've got it's like an upside down dome, so like a and it's based on the fact that high income countries have cold temperatures and higher growth rates, and lower latitude countries have higher temperatures and lower growth rates. And then in the far north, so how confident are you that that relationship reflects causality, as especially with respect to what's going on in the north? I mean, if I were to be skeptical about that, I'd say, well, there might be some serious climate damages in the north that aren't accounted for by that historical correlation.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and I can't see the Q&A or the chat, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some other questions about that as well. So that sort of inverted U shape has been derived before and extensively debated, and so we use it because it was sort of a tractable analytical tool for our research. That relationship is based on fluctuations over time in countries' climates and their economies, and so there are ways you can basically control for the average conditions that exist across the globe. So one thing you don't want to say Norway is warmer than Nigeria on average, and therefore Norway is cooler on average, so therefore being cooler is better. What you want to say is over time within a specific country, when that country is unseasonably warm or unseasonably cool, is its economy growing abnormally faster or abnormally slower? And that allows you to make these claims that are not based on pure correlation across the globe, cross-sectional relationships, as the economists like to say, and hopefully allows us to say something about the more causal relationships on a year-to-year basis in these fluctuations. But it's extremely stylized, and there's a lot more work to be done to understand the sort of causal relationships that might be underlying it.
Okay, so we've got a bunch of questions that are then from the floor.
Yeah, please.
One of them relates to whether you are in favor of a carbon tax. So that's a big picture question that maybe I'm going to put a hold on, but I do want to come back to that before the end.
Sure.
A second one would be the following. In your historical analysis, a commenter says, well, historical data should start with industrialization, like, for example, 1900. I guess the question is then how the time frame of your analysis affects your attribution results.
This is a really excellent question, and one that is really central to some of the existing debates over loss and damage in the international climate negotiations. What counts as emissions? You know, when we say the United States has emitted, over what time period are we talking about? Are we saying from 1850, from 1750?
Yeah.
When it's potentially you could claim that the warming effects of fossil fuel production had not been fully understood at that point. Maybe you want to start from 1980 or 1990, at which point the scientific consensus on climate change had become clear. The choice between those two sort of accounting choices is ultimately a political choice, and it's one that will be decided in international negotiations and in courtrooms in climate litigation. Our approach is ultimately limited by data. So we can only make claims about things for which we have data, and it is unfortunately the case that we only have really high quality continuous global economic data from about 1960 onwards in terms of GDP per capita in many countries around the world. And so we take a perspective that looks at climate impacts from sort of 1990 onward or 1960 onward to examine a couple of different start dates. But we have some emerging research that is hopefully going to go back a little further and try to understand what the accumulated effects of climate and emissions have been from the start time of industrialization, which might be 1850 or 1900.
Yep. Okay, so we have a question now that notes that climate stabilization is a huge challenge. And the questioner goes on to ask how you go about validating the kinds of models that you're working with based on historical data. And then the point is that the questioner notes that what happens with GDP growth can be influenced or maybe skewed by changes in the money supply, for example. And then they end by saying, do you think global trade, such as, the local food movement, or, not buying exotic fruits, or changes in tourism practices, how does that relate to carbon emissions and mitigation opportunities? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So there's a couple different things there that I want to sort of take in turn. The question of validation is a really hard one. So we can use statistical approaches that attempt to control for all the different external factors that influence an economy on sort of over space and time. So we can try and control for geography, long-term trends in productivity, institutions, hopefully as a result, sort of position in trade patterns and things along those lines, and try and isolate the climate effect that is external from those other influences. And we think we can do a pretty good job of that. And I'm happy to talk about some of the things that we call, for example, identifying assumptions and things along those lines. But the basic idea is that we think we can isolate fluctuations in temperature that are exogenous and all as good as randomly assigned with respect to the economy. So they are not being sort of correlated with changes in the money supply over time. And if that's the case, then we think we can draw causal claims about the role of climate change. However, that does not mean that climate change is the dominant effect on the economy, right? The thing that has controlled variations in economic growth over the last 50 years has been financial crises, wars, monetary and fiscal policy, demographic changes. All of these things have obviously been the primary knob that turns the economy. And so our goal here is not to say that climate change has been the dominant effect, but just to say, if it has had an effect, can we isolate and infer something about that? I do want to address the last part of this question, which is about global trade patterns and consumption and things along those lines. And I think that's a great question, because when thinking about the attribution of climate change to individual countries, an additional important accounting choice that you have to think about is what counts as emissions, and in particular, what counts as emissions in terms of where they are emitted. So what I'm getting at here is, if I buy a product from, like if I buy a t-shirt that's produced in Malaysia and it gets shipped across the ocean to me and built in a factory in Malaysia that has a smokestack on top and then shipped across the ocean to me where I buy it here in the United States, the emissions from that production did not occur in the United States, but you could argue that they are very much still as a result of my consumption. And so there are techniques called consumption-based emissions accounting that try to account for the sort of quote unquote embodied emissions in the global trade patterns that we participate in. And that is an important way for a different perspective and a just as valid, if not more valid way to assess the contribution of individual actors to warming, and a way for us to understand what potential changes to the way that our economy functions might be the key levers in reducing emissions. Now, despite all of my pretending, I'm not actually an economist, and so I am not an expert on sort of how changing global trade patterns can truly be the solution to climate change. But I will say that it's an active area of research and something that we were thinking a lot about when doing some of our work.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. We have a pair of questions or comments, really. I mean, one of them is the clarifying question, which relates to what latitudes are considered in the warm zone. And I guess if we extended that a little, we could ask what's happening in those areas that makes them different in terms of their sensitivity to climate impacts. And if we go to the other end, the poles, then there's a comment that in northern latitudes, permafrost damages affect structures, and of course maybe lead to feedbacks in terms of land use and land use change in methane.
Absolutely.
Comment on those aspects.
Absolutely. So what you consider the sort of warm zone is going to be different depending on what question you're asking. In the research we did, we found that the biggest effects of extreme heat started to manifest basically when you sort of move into like Mexico and Central America, the latitude where sort of Mexico and Central America are, and then moving into the sort of deep tropics of like the northern part of South America, Central Africa, and then Southeast Asia. And so that was like the core. You could sort of think of that as basically 30 south to 30 north, which is the traditional boundary of the tropics. Doesn't quite match those boundaries, but you could sort of basically think of it as that sort of central tropical zone. One key thing is that, as I said, places that are in the tropics are both lower income and they're lower emitting and they're warmer. All of these things might combine to make them different in terms of how the climate impacts manifest. So if you're warmer on average, if you have two places and one of them is warmer on average than the other, you might expect extreme heat to have a more severe effect in that place because you're already closer to sort of danger zone thresholds where we have these sort of physiological thresholds above which you can't survive if you're outside and you're not in air conditioning, or livestock start to die or crops start to die. There are these thresholds where you see this really strong behavior past that threshold. And so if you're closer to that threshold, extreme heat might be more damaging because it pushes you over that threshold more frequently.
Yeah, no, that's right. And those tend to be countries that have large agricultural sectors.
Exactly.
Low
The
income
economies
really depend on the land.
Exactly. The economies in these places
They're
are
also operating at temperatures where plants are likely to just shut down and not photosynthesize if it gets a little bit warmer, right?
Absolutely. So there's
okay,
both...
so let's see. We've got
a
couple other questions. Okay, you attribute damages from country level emissions, but activities that led to those emissions are in one country, such as inventing and using the steam engine, and also that led to huge economic benefits that spill over to other countries. Then the question is it really possible to attribute damages given innovation spillovers?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing we want to be clear about here is that, it's important to know that fossil fuels have been an engine of economic prosperity over the last 150 years. Like really fundamentally, the world economy and rising living standards for billions of people have been built on fossil fuels. And so that is not something we can neglect when doing this kind of research. The goal for our understanding of attributing damages is therefore not to say that that emissions from economic production in a specific place have only had negative effects on another place. They are to say that there has been one of the externalities associated with that has been the warming effect. And that is a specific externality that we have to understand in the context of, for example, emerging debates over loss and damage. However, it is important to recognize that is not a net calculation. That is a calculation only pertaining to the warming effect of emissions, and it should not be taken to imply that fossil fuels have had no economic or innovation benefits, because they very much have. And so it's very much just one piece of the puzzle. And that's the only conclusion we can reach in that regard.
All right, I think we've got, one more question, unless there are questions. But the last one here would relate to the carbon tax and what you think about the carbon tax versus maybe other tools that could be used for greenhouse gas emissions abatement.
That's a great question. And again, the statement that I only pretend to be an economist, like disclaimer, I only pretend to be an economist.
I've written on this question, but I'm not going to answer the question
you're the
for
actual
you.
Economist here. Feel free to jump in at any point. My like hot take, my like total shooting from the hip hot take response to this question is carbon taxes and carbon pricing as a sort of conceptual mechanism is really useful. When we talk about externalities, one thing we're talking about is unpriced costs of an activity, right? You have the price of the fossil fuel, but you don't have the sort of social costs associated with that. And so you could think about pricing that. That has a really attractive economic logic to it. I think one thing that we've seen happen in the United States and even in other countries as well is that carbon taxes have not been the central tool in the climate policy toolbox. The Inflation Reduction Act does not include carbon pricing as an explicit policy tool. It includes industrial policy, like investments in technology, and especially early technology that can sort of result in commercialization. And we've seen the use of just flat out emissions restrictions, like the Clean Power Plan, which force power plants to reduce their emissions. And so I would hesitate to rely on carbon pricing as the central tool in the toolbox. I think it is a component, but I would say it needs to be complemented by things like industrial policy, investments in research and development, and other tools that can sort of bring about a sort of whole of government and whole of society approach to the climate problem.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I'm thinking that in Europe, they're thinking seriously about implementing what's called the carbon border adjustment tax. And that's back to the question of international trade, because of course in Europe, they're using carbon pricing as one of a whole bunch of different mechanisms to achieve what they call the European Green Deal. Now, if they start taxing goods that have high carbon content that are imported from countries that aren't mitigating climate, that really could change trade patterns in a very interesting way. Although one of the concerns that's raised about that mechanism is the possibility that relatively wealthy Europeans would be forcing low-income countries to move towards lower emissions, higher cost technologies. And so, I mean, there's a distributional equity thing there that relates to, you studied the climate impacts and the responsibility for that, but there's also an equity aspect to burden sharing in terms of emissions abatement. Absolutely. I think, do you have closing thoughts for us? This is such a wonderful engagement and presentation and discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks everyone for asking their questions and attending. I think to the extent that I have a closing thought, it's just it is to emphasize the need for thinking across disciplines and across methodological approaches and across ways of asking questions. As you sort of said in your introduction, Rich, the climate problem is, it's a multidimensional problem. It's a problem that cuts across disciplines and ways of knowing and locations and all these other phenomena. And so in our scientific approaches, our economic approaches, our political approaches, we need to be really capacious in our willingness to accept both alternative perspectives, alternative visions of science when we're sort of seeing in scientific settings, and in sort of good faith alternative perspectives when we're thinking about addressing the climate problem from a societal perspective. And so that has motivated my attempt to be as interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary as I can as part of my graduate program in ecology, evolution, environment, and society, and in the Irving Institute. And so I hope that we as a community can continue to model that openness and multidisciplinarity, and hopefully make that a core of the way that we approach climate scientifically. Yeah, well, as you know, I admire your work, and I really like the work that you did in this presentation. I'd like to thank you and thank our audience. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Rich, for moderating. That was great. Chris, we really appreciate you being here to sort of walk us through this really complicated and multidisciplinary work that you've been doing. So thank you for that. So for everyone else, we have more New Energy coming up. I believe in 2 weeks, we have our next New Energy session will be on. We have a researcher, Sean Fields, who will be joining us from the University of St. Andrews. And then every other week after that, we'll have 2 more folks joining us for New Energy this winter. So I hope you can join us for those. And thank you again to our speaker and to our moderator, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everyone.